If you haven't already done so, go ahead and turn in your Bibles to 2 Corinthians, the 12th chapter. Now, I would encourage you when you can, just read the whole chapter, and the chapter before. I'll read the whole thing, but I'm just going to focus on a few of the verses here, but we'll read from the 6th verse through the 10th verse. For if I want to boast, I wouldn't be a fool, because I would be telling the truth. But I will spare you so that no one can credit me with something beyond what he sees in me or hears from me, especially because of the extraordinary revelations. Therefore, so that I would not exalt myself, a thorn in the flesh was given to me, a messenger of Satan to torment me, so that I would not exalt myself. Concerning this, I pleaded with the Lord 3 times that it would leave me. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is perfected in weakness. Therefore, I will most gladly boast all the more about my weakness, so that Christ's power may reside in me. So I take pleasure in weakness, insults, hardships, persecutions, and difficulties for the sake of Christ. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Paul, when he started this, where I picked up reading, Paul had been telling the Corinthians about, so he doesn't know if he actually physically went there, or whether it was just a dream, that he'd gone to heaven and had so many things revealed to him. But he knew that he could easily become conceited about it, become boastful about it. So he tells the Corinthians that even if he wanted to boast, he wouldn't be a fool for doing it. He'd be telling the truth. But in order to keep him from being too self-centered, too self-boastful, God had given him a thorn in the flesh. And we don't know what that thorn is. He never describes exactly what it is. It could be a physical infirmity. It could have been his eyesight. It could have been some other health issues. It could have been something spiritual. He was dealing a lot with the Judaizers, and I'm sure he prayed for them to go away. I know in my ministry, I've prayed for the Judaizers to go away. For those who are so focused on the law, they forget about grace. Mostly I pray that they'll accept God's grace. So we don't know what Paul was praying about. It could have been an individual that was a thorn in his flesh. It could have been a whole group. It could have been, like I said, health issues. We don't know. We don't have to know, because by not knowing, it allows us to apply Paul's words to our own lives. We can apply the truth that Paul gives us here to our own lives and understand that whatever our thorns are, that God can use them to make us stronger. Because as Paul says, his power works best in weakness. God, our Lord, has been called by some the God of the gap, or the gaps. And by those who say that, they mean that humanity only needs a deity when we can't explain the mysteries. When science and technology doesn't explain what's going on, then we need a God to lay it on. Mind you, I don't agree with that statement. I'm just saying that's what some people think of when you say God of the gaps. The assumption is that the need to believe in God decreases as science increases, or understanding of the world and its mysteries increases. This false assumption suggests that one day we'll have enough natural explanations not to need a deity at all. I feel bad for those people, but that's what they believe. That approach is superficial, and that sort of God of the gaps that they describe is completely unnecessary, and it's an unnecessary reduction of God's role. However, we can certainly embrace another sense of that term, of God of gaps, or the God of our gaps. Because in the gaps of our lives, we need him desperately. We can believe in a God of our own gaps. In fact, that's where he most often shows up in power and in miracles. Wherever we're needy, broken, weak, that's where he rises up in strength to provide, repair, and defend us. It's in those gaps, in those times when we just don't have the answer. While we try to cover up our vulnerabilities and establish our strength, he waits for us to realize how incapable we are without him. Jamie and I had raised a lot of little birds over the years, cage birds, house, pet type birds. And one thing you learn when you have that kind of aviary is a sick bird, a weak bird, will not display its illness. And those of you who get out in the wild, you know that animals won't display their weakness, their illness until it's too late, usually. We've seen more than one bird that we thought was healthy. We missed the signs, and the bird was dead a day or so later because they hide their weakness, because that's what they have to do. And people can be the same way. We can hide our weaknesses. We try to hide them from God, but he knows what they are. Really, we're just hiding them from ourselves. And God's waiting for us to admit, as Paul has, to our weaknesses and our needs, so that he can step in. He can step in because you want him to, not because he forces himself in. When we're finally at the end of our rope, that's when he's finally able to act without anyone mistaking his victories for our own self-effort. When we've given up all hope, that's when God has the most authority. Paul had prayed for the thorn to go away, but let's read that verse 9 again. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is perfected in weakness. Therefore, I will most gladly boast, Paul says, I will most gladly boast all the more about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may reside in me. I wish we could all recognize what Paul saw. It's difficult to cry out to God sometimes when we think we can do it ourselves. Paul recognized that he couldn't, and he trusted God. Everyone has gaps, places where our strength runs out, our wisdom fails, where it falls short anyways, and our confidence crumbles. And like I said, the world teaches us to hide our weaknesses like those birds. But God says, bring them to me. Our gaps are not God's obstacles. They may be ours, but they're not his obstacles. They are his opportunities to reveal himself with power and authority. This passage shows us that God's power doesn't compete with our weaknesses, it completes it. Think of a cracked clay pot. When a candle is placed inside that pot, the light shines through all those cracks. The gaps let the light out. That's what God does with us. He shines through our weaknesses. When we turn our problems over to God, and then his power shines through those faults, those gaps, those illnesses, those problems we're dealing with. When we let him shine through to the world around us, it's a powerful testimony to the glory of God. Paul's problems. His problem was he had a thorn that wouldn't go away. Paul speaks of a thorn in the flesh, and again, I don't know what that was. It was something painful, either physically or spiritually, something humbling and persistent. Paul says it kept him humble. Paul recognized that he couldn't do it himself, and that kept him humble. Whatever the problem was, Paul knew he couldn't fix it. But God could, and that kept Paul humble. Paul says he prayed 3 times for it to be removed. God said no, because that thorn kept Paul dependent on God. We can see that in other scriptures, not just what Paul says in Psalm 34:18. The Lord is near the brokenhearted. He saves those crushed in spirit. And James, I always love to go to James when I can, but James 4:6 tells us God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. And we need to remember what grace is as God's free gift of salvation, and everything else that he gives us is by grace. And James says the proud resist that, they resist God. But he gives grace to the humble. God doesn't always remove the thorn. Paul's thorn, even after 3 times he prayed for it, God didn't take whatever that thorn was away. But he always supplies the grace. He allows us to feel our need, our own needs, so that we can also feel his nearness. When we're dealing with some problem in our life, some crack in our veneer that we can't fix, it allows us, when we turn it over to God, it allows us to feel nearer to him. God answers Paul not by taking away his weakness, but by giving him grace within it. That word sufficient. God told him, my grace is sufficient. It means enough. Enough for every situation, for every sorrow, for every struggle. God's grace doesn't just patch up the gap, like taking epoxy on that clay pot and filling in the cracks. He doesn't just patch up the gap. He fills it with his power. In Philippians 4:13, Paul says, I'm able to do all things through him who strengthens me. Paul understood that in his weakness, he couldn't do anything, but in God's power, he could do everything that God expected of him. It's not just a New Testament concept, it's Old Testament as well. The prophet Isaiah said he gives strength to the faint and strengthens the powerless. So it wasn't new with Jesus, it wasn't new with the New Testament as we call it. That truth has always been here. The truth that Jesus himself expressed in John 15, apart from me, you can do nothing. Think of it kind of like a power outlet. The socket in your wall. You can take one of those outlets, cut a hole in the wall, and just put it in there, plug something into it. It's not going to do much, is it? It's only useful when you connect it to the source of power. Our weaknesses can be like empty sockets waiting for God's current to flow through. So when we come to the end of ourselves, we come to the beginning of his grace. Paul understood that, and we need to understand that as well. Paul said God's power is perfected in weakness. That word perfected means brought to completion. It doesn't just mean something's made to look beautiful and perfect. Perfected means something's brought to completion. Paul certainly wasn't healed, but he was still perfected, or being perfected. Because even in his weakness, even in whatever that thorn was, God was bringing him to completion. He was being made fully effective. It's the other definition for perfected, something being made fully effective. God's strength doesn't just assist our weaknesses. He's not just there to assist us in our weaknesses. He's there to inhabit our weakness. To work through our weakness. When we surrender, he fills the space that we can't fill. Romans 8:26, Paul tells us, the Romans, the Spirit also helps us in our weakness. Back in Exodus, God told Israel, the Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still. God wanted them to understand that they didn't have to do anything in some of those battles. God himself went out and fought for them. And the author of Hebrews tells us out of weakness that they were made strong. Think of Gideon. I'm sure you're familiar with the story of Gideon, how God had him send troops home. He'd gotten Gideon to get together an army, and then he had Gideon sending troops home until it got down to 300 men. They were going up against thousands. But he reduced their numbers so that Israel couldn't boast, that they could see that their victory was God's victory, not their own victory. The smaller they became, the greater God appeared to them, the greater his glory appeared. Truth is, he could have done it with just one man. I think he wanted 300 witnesses. Our weakness is the canvas on which God paints his strength. His power works best when we stop pretending that we have any real power of our own. That it's his power. And that's true whether we're talking about our personal problems or whether we're talking about our national problems. We're weak and unable to deal with it, but he is the real power. We just have to give it to him instead of thinking we can do it all ourselves. Paul's perspective shows us or tells us to rejoice in the gaps. Paul says he boasts in his weaknesses. And that's not out of pride. It's a humble kind of boasting. When you say, well, I know I can't do it, but God can. You boast out of trust. He was boasting out of trust. Weaknesses invite the presence of Christ, so that his power may reside in us, or as Paul said, so that Christ's power may reside in me. He learned that the lowest points of life can be the highest places of faith. I've learned that many times in my life. When Tom called me to tell me that his father had had a stroke, I knew that he was down, that he was, I tried to give him words of encouragement. When he texted me later, telling me that his father was through the worst part of the times, I could tell that Tom had gotten some strength back on that. But placing his faith in God strengthened him. The same applies for all of us when we turn our problems over to God, whatever the problem may be. Psalm 73, verse 26 tells us, "My flesh and my heart may fail, but God is the strength of my heart, my portion forever." Again, I can't do it. My flesh isn't strong enough to do it, but God can and will when I turn it over to Him. Jesus Himself said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit." He wasn't talking about poor financially. He was talking about poor in spirit, people who didn't have that proudness, that overreaching pride that they could do everything. He said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for the kingdom of heaven is theirs." Famous missionary Hudson Taylor said, all God's giants have been weak men who did great things for God because they reckoned on His being with them. And that's true of all the great preachers out there. All the great awakenings in the past, all the revivals. They've been led by men who knew that they couldn't do it by themselves, that they needed the power of God. We need to recognize that now. I'm always praying for revival, praying for another great awakening, praying for the world to become a better place, but you know what? I can't do it, and neither can you. But if we keep praying for it, I know God can do it. The more we're aware of our gaps, the more we become aware of His grace. That's where He shows up in the gaps between our need and His supply. God doesn't just dwell in our triumphs. He dwells in our tensions and our problems. The gap between who we are and who we're called to be is filled by His grace. So today, instead of hiding your weaknesses, hand it over to Him. Because in your gaps, He is God. He loves to fill feeble, broken vessels with divine strength. And His presence attends our weaknesses. So present your weaknesses to God. Do it with all your lack and with all your brokenness. Whatever gaps you have, let God fill them. Let Him fill them with His strength and His grace and His provision and His healing. God is glorified far more in the deserts and valleys of our lives than in the gardens and the mountain peaks. And that's good news for us because we have far more deserts and valleys to offer Him than we have gardens and peaks. And He welcomes that. He promises to fill those places, to fill them with Himself. Again, as Paul said in verse 10, "For when I am weak, then I am strong." We can believe in God. We can believe in a God of our gaps. In the spaces where we are weakest, His strength shines through brightest. And that's my invitation. Turn your gaps, turn your weaknesses and your problems over to God. And I know I've preached about this before, and you'll hear me preach about it again. Because in God's grace, He wants us to remember that He is here when we're at our weakest point. And that makes it more possible for us to give Him glory when we're strong. It's our word of prayer.